All right, welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're taking on something I think a lot of folks have been wondering about, especially with all the talk about, realistic avatars and metaverses and all that.
Yeah, definitely.
We're talking about basically how to get a computer to take a single image of a person, like a photo, and turn it into a fully realized 3D model.
Right. A model that you can then, rotate, view from any angle, all that.
Exactly. And not just like a basic blocky 3D model. We want the high fidelity, like capture all the details, the way clothing drapes, the texture of skin, the way hair moves.
The subtle stuff that makes a digital human actually look believable. That's the hard part.
Right. And it's not just about like pretty pictures either. This kind of tech has huge implications for how machines understand us, how they interact with us, and how we build these immersive digital environments.
Absolutely. I mean, think about it.
Yeah.
If a computer can truly understand a 3D human form from just a single 2D image.
That unlocks a ton of potential.
Yeah, a ton.
But it's not easy.
Right. No. Definitely not. There's a whole history of research on this.
Yeah.
And it's only recently that we've started making real progress, especially when you factor in the need for high resolution and consistency across different viewpoints.
So that's what we're going to untangle today. We've got a really interesting paper that tackles this head on. It's called Drumroll, Please.
Meet Multiview Diffusion Model for Human Generation on Megapixels with Mesh Attention.
Catchy, right?
Hey.
But seriously, this paper proposes some really innovative techniques, particularly this idea of mesh attention, and it leverages a really cool data set of human motion capture.
It's pretty clever stuff.
So let's dive in. Can you give us the big picture? What's the core problem this research is addressing, and why has it been so tricky to solve, especially at the level of detail we're talking about?
Sure. So the core challenge here is generating consistent multi-view images of humans. What that means is you start with a single image, and you want the model to be able to create images of that same person from any viewpoint.
Right.
And we want these images to be high resolution, like megapixel resolution, so you can really see all the details.
And they have to be consistent. Like if you rotate the model just a little bit, the clothing, the hair, all of that should move in a way that makes sense.
Exactly. That's the tricky part. And traditional multi-view diffusion models, the kind of AI models that are really good at generating images, they struggle with this, especially at higher resolutions.
Yeah.
Like they either can't handle the complexity or they become computationally way too expensive.
So they just couldn't handle it before, basically.
Yeah. I mean, most existing multi-view diffusion models, they're trained on images that are much lower resolution, maybe 256 by 256 pixels. Some might go up to like 500 something.
Right.
But for humans, you need higher resolution to capture all the nuances.
To really get those details, right?
Right. And if you try to just like scale up those existing models to work at higher resolutions, well, the computational cost just explodes. So the memory requirements for all that processing, it gets insane.
So what was the workaround? Like what did they try before to address that?
Well, some methods relied on making certain assumptions, like using orthographic projection, which basically treats the object as flat. But that limits you. Right? Because real-world objects, especially humans, are three-dimensional. They have depth and complex shapes.
So it wasn't a great solution for something like a human, which can move and bend and contort into all kinds of different shapes.
Exactly. It was a trade-off. You could get okay results at lower resolutions, but if you wanted that high-fidelity, realistic output at megapixel resolutions, it was basically out of reach.
Okay, so this is where meat comes in, right?
Right.
With this mesh attention idea. Can you break that down for us? Like, what is that, and how does it help solve those problems?
Yeah, so mesh attention. It's kind of the heart of what makes meat work. Instead of having every single pixel in one view, try to figure out its relationship with every other pixel in all the other possible views, which is what makes things so computationally expensive.
Like a brute force approach.
Yeah, exactly. Instead of that, meat uses a simplified 3D model of a human. You can think of it like a mannequin or a basic skeletal structure.
Okay, so they're using a basic 3D model as a guide.
Right. And this 3D model, it's called a mesh. So they use this mesh as a reference point, and they use some clever techniques to essentially project this 3D mesh onto different virtual camera views.
So like they're taking that mannequin and creating a silhouette of it from different angles.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
And this gives them really direct information about how pixels in one view correspond to pixels in other views. It's all based on the geometry of that 3D mesh.
I see. So they're using this mesh to establish relationships between pixels across different views instead of having to figure it out from the raw image data.
Exactly. And that makes things way more efficient computationally.
Okay, that makes sense. And this is how they can get up to those higher resolutions, right?
Yes. They're able to generate those megapixel resolution images, heat 0124 by 1024 pixels, while still maintaining consistency across different views. It's a big breakthrough.
And it allows them to capture those fine details, like the way fabric drapes, the wrinkles on a shirt, the individual strands of hair, all those things we need to make a digital human truly believable.
Absolutely. That level of detail was just not possible before with multiview diffusion models.
Okay, we've got the big picture.
Yeah.
Now let's get into the nitty-gritty of how this all works. The paper starts by laying out the problem, right?
Right. They start by stating very clearly what they're trying to solve.
Which is?
The challenge of generating photorealistic and consistent multi-view images of humans from a single frontal image and doing it at high resolution. They emphasize the need for that high resolution, that megapixel detail, to capture the important nuances of human appearance.
Things like faces, hands, clothing, all those things that are notoriously difficult to get right.
Right.
And they point out that existing methods, the existing multi-view diffusion models, just aren't cutting it.
Yeah. The typical resolution you see in these models, it's way lower, often around 256 by 256 pixels. Sometimes they might push it up to 500 or so, but that's still not enough for humans.
And simply trying to scale those existing models up, it just doesn't work.
It hits a wall computationally. The memory requirements get out of control.
Yeah.
It's just not practical.
So their solution is mesh attention, right?
Correct. They introduced this concept of mesh attention, where they use a 3D mesh of a human to establish these pixel correspondences across different views. And they use techniques like rasterization and projection to achieve this efficiently.
Okay, so let's unpack those terms. We've talked about mesh, but what are rasterization and projection in this context?
Sure. So imagine you have this 3D mesh, this basic model of a human. Rasterization is essentially the process of converting that 3D model into a 2D image. It's like taking a snapshot of that mesh from a specific viewpoint. And projection is about figuring out where points on that 3D mesh would appear in a 2D image given a specific camera perspective.
So it's like they're taking that mesh and projecting its shadow onto a virtual screen, which is their image.
Exactly. And by doing this from multiple virtual camera angles, they can determine which pixels in one view correspond to the same point on the 3D mesh as pixels in other views.
It's like triangulating the location of a point in 3D space by looking at it from multiple angles.
Precisely. And they don't stop there. They also incorporate something called key point conditioning.
What's that?
Think of it like using the detected locations of key joints on the body, elbows, knees, wrists, as extra information to help guide the image generation process. It's especially helpful when dealing with complex poses.
Okay, so it's like giving the model additional hints about the pose to make sure it gets it right.
Exactly. And then, perhaps most importantly, they developed a way to train their model on multi-view human motion videos.
Why is that so significant?
Because it addresses this long-standing problem of not having enough high-quality, diverse training data specifically for human models. Most existing high-resolution 3D scan data is of static poses, like people just standing there. But humans, we move, we're dynamic.
So they needed a way to teach their model how humans move in the real world.
Right, and these multi-view videos, they provide a wealth of information about human motion, different poses, different body types, all of that.
That makes sense. And they highlight that their main contributions are this mesh attention mechanism, the meat model itself, and this innovative pipeline for training on these multi-view human motion videos.
Yes, those are the key innovations.
Okay, so let's put all this in context. This paper doesn't exist in a vacuum. What were some of the earlier approaches to this problem, and what limitations were researchers bumping up against that MEAT is now addressing?
So before we had these all-singing, all-dancing diffusion models, people were tackling this multi-view generation problem in different ways. One of the earlier approaches was to generate the views one at a time.
So they'd create one view, then another, and so on.
Yeah, exactly. And a classic example of this is a model called 0, 1 to 3.
Okay.
And this model, it was pretty groundbreaking at the time, but it had a big problem. It often created inconsistencies between the generated views.
Because it wasn't thinking about all the views at the same time.
Right. Each view was kind of generated in isolation, so things like the position of a hand or the way clothing draped, it might not match up perfectly from one view to the next.
So you get these weird jumps or artifacts when you try to rotate the model.
Exactly. And that's because the model didn't have a global understanding of the 3D structure of the person.
So that led to the development of these all view at once methods.
Exactly. These methods, they generate all the target views in parallel at the same time.
Okay.
And they use clever mechanisms like cross-view attention to try to ensure consistency across all those views.
Cross-view attention, what's that?
It's basically a way for the model to look at information from all the different views simultaneously to make sure things match up.
So it's like the model is constantly checking to make sure the left hand in one view is in the same position as the left hand in all the other views.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Okay, that makes sense. And what are some examples of these all view at once models?
There are a bunch of interesting models in this category. You've got MV Dream, Image Dream, Wonder 3D, Epidif, Air-A 3D. These are all models that have made significant contributions.
They still have limitations, right?
Yes. Despite being more advanced, these all-view-at-once models often face trade-offs. They might struggle with resolution, being able to generate high-resolution images.
Going back to that computational cost problem.
Exactly. Or they might have to rely on certain assumptions about the scene or the camera setup, which limits their applicability to real-world scenarios.
So they were better, but they still weren't perfect.
Right. They were getting closer, but they still couldn't achieve that combination of high-fidelity detail and cross-view consistency that we're looking for, especially at the resolution needed for realistic human representation.
Okay. That makes sense. Now, alongside these multiview diffusion models, there's also been a lot of work on monocular human reconstruction, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Can you explain what that is and how it ties into this whole picture?
Sure. So monocular human reconstruction, it's all about taking a single 2D image of a person and trying to reconstruct a 3D model of them from that one image.
So essentially, it's trying to infer the missing 3D information from a flat image.
Exactly. And there are different approaches to this. You've got optimization-based methods, which tend to focus on getting the geometry as accurate as possible. Icon, Econ, Tech, CFew. These are all examples of this approach.
And these methods are good at capturing the shape, the pose, the proportions of the person.
Right. They're very precise, but they can be computationally intensive.
And then you've got the feed-forward network-based approaches.
Right. These methods, they use neural networks to directly estimate the 3D structure of the person from the image. A well-known example is PIFU, which stands for Pixel-Aligned Implicit Function.
And these are typically faster, right?
Yes, they can be much faster, but they might not always be as accurate as the optimization-based methods. It's a trade-off.
Okay, so we've got these two main branches of research. Multiview diffusion models, which are good at generating images but struggle with high resolution and consistency, and monocular human reconstruction methods, which are good at getting the 3D structure but maybe not so good at generating high-quality images.
Right. And MEAT, in a sense, it tries to bridge those two worlds. It leverages the power of diffusion models for image generation, but incorporates insights and techniques from monocular reconstruction, particularly through the use of that 3D mesh, to achieve both high fidelity and consistency.
So it's like combining the best of both worlds.
Exactly.
Okay, now let's really dig into the technical details of how this mesh attention mechanism works. You mentioned rasterization earlier, right?
Right.
Walk us through that. How do they use that to establish the connection between the 2D image pixels and the 3D mesh?
So imagine you're standing in front of a window and you trace the outline of a person standing outside onto the glass. That's kind of like rasterization.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
You're taking a 3D object, in this case, the person, and creating a 2D representation of it on a flat surface, the window.
So in the case of MEAT, they're doing this with the 3D human mesh, projecting it onto a virtual image plane.
Exactly. They're using virtual cameras and casting rays from each pixel on that virtual image plane towards the 3D mesh. If a ray hits the mesh, they record information about where it hit, which triangle on the mesh, the exact coordinates within that triangle, all that.
So they're essentially mapping every pixel in the image to a specific point on the surface of that 3D mesh.
Right, and that mapping, that connection between the 2D pixels and the 3D mesh, it's the key to mesh attention.
Okay, so they have this mapping. Now what? How do they use it to make the whole diffusion process more efficient?
This is where it gets really clever. Instead of having each pixel in one view attend to every pixel in all the other views, which is super computationally expensive.
Like trying to compare every single point on that window tracing to every other point on a tracing from a different angle.
Yeah, a super brute force approach. Yeah. What they do instead is they use that 3D mesh mapping. They take a pixel in one view, they know where it corresponds to on the 3D mesh, and they project that 3D point onto the other views.
So they're using the 3D mesh as a shortcut.
Exactly. It's like saying, instead of comparing all those points directly, let's use our knowledge of the underlying 3D structure to guide us.
That makes a lot of sense. And this is why they can get away with processing those high-resolution images without the computational cost exploding.
Right. And there's another clever thing they do. It's called aggregated rasterization.
What's that about?
So the feature maps within the neural network, they often operate at a lower resolution than the final image.
Okay.
And if you try to do this rasterization, this mapping between pixels and the mesh, at that low resolution, you can miss things. Like you might miss the edges of objects or the fine details.
Because the low resolution is kind of blurring things out.
Right. So to avoid this, they perform the rasterization at a higher resolution and then downsample the results.
So they're getting a more accurate mapping by working with a higher level of detail and then simplifying it.
Exactly. It's all about ensuring that the connection between the 2D pixels and the 3D mesh is as accurate and precise as possible.
Okay, that's really clever. And once they have this mapping, they can use it to guide the attention mechanism.
Right. The attention mechanism, it's like a spotlight. It tells the model which parts of the image to focus on when generating the output.
And instead of having that spotlight wander around aimlessly, trying to compare everything to everything else, they're using the 3D mesh to point it in the right direction.
Exactly. They're saying, hey, focus on these pixels because they're the ones that correspond to this specific point on the 3D mesh. And that's what's going to help us generate a consistent and high-fidelity image.
Got it. And this all happens within the broader framework of a diffusion model, right?
Yes. The mesh attention mechanism, it's a key component of their overall multi-view diffusion model.
So can you walk us through that framework? How does it all fit together?
Sure. So like any diffusion model, they have an encoder and a decoder. The encoder takes the input image and compresses it down into a smaller representation called a latent code.
Okay.
And then they have a denoising U-net, which is the heart of the diffusion process. This U-net, it takes that latent code along with some noise and tries to progressively remove that noise to generate the final image.
And this is where the mesh attention comes in.
Exactly. The mesh attention blocks, they're integrated into the U-net architecture. They're used to guide the flow of information between different views during the image generation process.
So at each step, the model is not just looking at the noisy image, it's also looking at the 3D mesh and using that to figure out how to denoise the image in a way that's consistent with the overall 3D structure.
Exactly. And they're not just using the 3D mesh, they also incorporate those key points, the joint locations, as additional conditioning information.
Right, to help with those complex poses.
And they emphasize the importance of using a high-resolution VAE, a specific type of encoder-decoder, to capture all the detail of human appearance.
And they use a linear noise schedule during training.
Yes, they found that this helps improve the consistency of the generated images.
Okay, so that's the training process. Now let's talk about inference. How do they apply this model to real-world images, images that it's never seen before?
So for a new image, they start by cropping it to a standard size.
Okay.
Then they use a monocular human reconstruction method, specifically econ, to estimate a 3D mesh of the person in the image.
So they're using a pre-trained model to create that 3D mannequin.
Exactly. And econ also gives them the SMPLX parameters. SMPLX, it's a parametric model of a human body. It has parameters that control things like the body shape, the pose, all that.
Okay.
And econ, it assumes an orthographic camera projection, which basically means it's looking at the person from a straight-on view with no perspective. But in the real world, images are taken with perspective cameras.
So things look different depending on the angle you're viewing them from.
Right. So they do an extra step to estimate a frontal perspective camera. They assume a fixed field of view and orient the camera towards the pelvis, then optimize its position to align the rendered 3D key points from the reconstructed mesh with the 2D key points detected in the input image.
So they're essentially adjusting the virtual camera to match the perspective of the real camera that took the input image.
Right. Once they have that, they can sample a bunch of virtual camera parameters that orbit around the person so they can generate images from different viewpoints.
And then they use the mesh attention mechanism to ensure that those generated images are consistent and high fidelity.
Exactly. They project the 3D mesh points onto each of those virtual views, and they use that information to guide the diffusion process.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, you mentioned earlier that they use this DNA rendering data set, which is this collection of multi-view human motion videos.
Yes.
Tell us more about that data set. What is it, and how did they adapt it to train their model?
So the DNA rendering dataset, it's a huge collection of videos of people moving around, performing different actions.
Okay.
And these videos, they're captured from multiple viewpoints simultaneously.
So it's like having a bunch of cameras set up around a person all recording at the same time.
Right. And that's great because it gives you a really rich data set of human motion captured from different angles.
But it doesn't come with 3D mesh information, right?
The data set provides images, but not the 3D mesh that Meet needs.
So they had to create those meshes themselves?
Exactly. They developed a whole pipeline for doing this. For each video sequence, they'd select a representative frontal frame and use PIEHD to reconstruct a 3D mesh from that frame.
PIHD?
PIVHD is another monocular human reconstruction method. It takes a single image and creates a 3D model from it.
Okay.
And they had to align this reconstructed mesh to the dataset's 3D coordinate system.
What does that mean?
So the dataset, it has its own defined 3D space. It's like a virtual room where everything is positioned. But the mesh they reconstruct from the image, it's in its own arbitrary 3D space.
So they had to match those two spaces up?
Right. They had to figure out the translation, rotation, and scaling needed to perfectly align the reconstructed mesh within the dataset's 3D environment.
That sounds tricky.
It is. They used a technique called ROMA, which stands for Robust Mesh Alignment, to do this. It involves finding corresponding points between different views of the subject and then using an optimization algorithm to solve for the best alignment.
And this was important because it allowed them to use that mesh information to train their model.
Exactly. Without that alignment, the mesh wouldn't be useful for training.
Okay, so they put in a lot of work to create this training data set. Now, the big question, how well did it actually work? How did Meet perform in their experiments compared to other state-of-the-art methods?
So they compared Meet to a whole bunch of different methods, including Stable 0123, Sync Dreamer, Wonder 3D, SV3D, and Magic Man.
And these are all leading models in multiview generation.
Yes, these are all top contenders.
Okay.
And to make sure the comparison was fair, they even retrained some of those models using their key point conditioning technique, just to level the playing field.
That's good. It makes the comparison more meaningful.
And they used a whole suite of quantitative metrics to evaluate the results.
Like what?
Well, for evaluating how well the model could reconstruct the original image from a single view, they used PSNR, SM, and LPIPS.
And these metrics, they measure things like the similarity between the reconstructed image and the original input image.
Right. They measure the fidelity of the reconstruction.
Okay.
And then they used FID and patch FID to evaluate the quality of the generated novel views, the views from different angles.
And FID, it measures how realistic the generated images are, right?
Yeah. It compares the distribution of features in the generated images to the distribution of features in real images. And patch FID, it's specifically designed for high-resolution images. It breaks the image down into smaller patches and computes FID on those patches.
Okay.
And finally, they use a metric called PPLC, which stands for Perceptual Patch Level Consistency, to measure how consistent the generated images were across different viewpoints.
So it's checking to see if the details match up when you rotate the model.
Exactly.
Okay, so they had all these metrics. What did the results show? Did Meet live up to the hype?
It did. It outperformed all the other methods across pretty much all the metrics.
So it was better at reconstructing the original image, better at generating realistic novel views, and better at maintaining consistency across those views.
Yes, across the board.
Wow.
That's impressive.
It is, especially considering they were able to achieve this at that high 1024 by 1024 resolution.
So it really was a significant step forward in terms of both quality and resolution.
Absolutely. It pushed the boundaries of what was possible with multi-view human generation. Okay, so Meet clearly performed well. Did they also do any ablation studies to understand which parts of their method were contributing the most to those results?
Yes, they did a number of ablation studies. First, they showed that just trying to increase the resolution of a baseline model without any of the other innovations they introduced, it didn't work well. The generated images were full of artifacts and the consistency was poor.
So resolution alone wasn't enough.
Right. You needed the mesh attention. You needed the key point conditioning. You needed all the pieces working together.
Okay, so they showed that all the components were necessary. What else did they test?
They also showed that key point conditioning, while helpful, wasn't enough on its own to guarantee consistency across views. It helped with the pose, but the texture and appearance of the person could still be inconsistent.
So you needed that mesh attention to really tie everything together.
Exactly. And they compared different variations of mesh attention. They tested aversion with and without the attention applied to the VAE features. And they found that including those VAE features was important for maintaining local consistency in the generated images.
So it was about making sure that not just the overall shape, but also the fine details were consistent from one view to the next.
Right. And they compared their mesh attention to other types of attention mechanisms, like dense attention and epipolar attention.
And how did it stack up?
It beat them all. It was not only more efficient, computationally, which is super important for high resolution, but it also produced better quantitative results.
So it was both faster and better.
Exactly.
And they also validated the importance of training at that high 2024 resolution.
Right. They showed that the VAE, the encoder-decoder, performed much better at reconstructing details and preserving identity when trained at that higher resolution.
Okay, so they really did their due diligence in terms of testing and validating their approach.
They did. And they didn't stop there. They even tested the model's robustness to noisy key point predictions, and they showed that even with some errors in the key point locations, the model still performed well.
So it was able to handle some imperfections in the input data.
Right. And they tested the model on a variety of different poses and movements, and it generalized well across all of them.
That's really good. It means the model isn't just overfitting to the specific examples it was trained on. It's actually learning something fundamental about human structure and movement.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the technical details. Now let's zoom out a bit. Can you talk about the historical context of this work? Like, where does it fit within the broader landscape of 3D human modeling and rendering? And why is this research such a big deal?
Sure. So the pursuit of creating realistic digital humans, it's been going on for a long time. We started with traditional methods like 3D scanning.
Where you basically shine a bunch of lasers at a person and capture their shape.
Right. And those methods, they can be very accurate, but they're expensive, they're time-consuming, and they require specialized equipment.
Not something you can easily do at home.
No, definitely not. And then people started exploring learning-based approaches, trying to use machine learning to infer 3D information from 2D images.
The monocular human reconstruction methods we talked about earlier?
Exactly. And those methods made a lot of progress, but they often struggled with the level of detail, and they weren't always very good at generalizing to new poses or different body types.
Okay.
And then came the rise of generative models, particularly diffusion models, which have completely revolutionized the field of image generation.
And they're starting to make their way into 3D as well.
Right. Multiview diffusion models, they represent a natural progression in this evolution. They're taking these powerful generative models and applying them to the problem of generating consistent 3D representations from 2D inputs.
So MEET is building on this whole history of research and pushing it further by addressing those key challenges of resolution, consistency, and lack of suitable training data.
Exactly. And it's kind of analogous to what we've seen in image generation. When we were able to generate images at higher and higher resolutions, it unlocked a whole new level of realism and detail.
It's like the difference between a blurry photo and a crisp, high-definition image.
Right. And MEET is aiming to achieve that same kind of leap forward for multi-view human generation.
So it's really setting the stage for the future of this field. Okay, to wrap things up, can you summarize the key takeaways from this paper in a nice, concise way?
Sure. I'd say the biggest takeaway is that they've shown that it's possible to generate high-resolution, consistent multi-view images of humans from a single image using a novel approach called mesh attention.
And that mesh attention, it's a game changer because it solves that computational bottleneck that was holding back previous methods.
Exactly. And they've also highlighted the importance of having good training data. Their work with the DNA rendering dataset, it shows that having diverse multi-view data of human motion is essential for training models that can generalize well.
And they've also made it clear that we need to be thinking about higher resolutions, that megapixel level of detail, if we want to create truly realistic digital humans.
Absolutely.
Okay, so those are the big technical takeaways. Now let's talk about the implications. What are some of the potential real-world applications of this technology once it matures a bit?
Well, the most obvious one is the creation of more realistic and immersive avatars for virtual environments, like the metaverse.
Right. Imagine being able to create a digital representation of yourself that looks and moves just like you do in real life. Expert speaker.